Last summer, if you were around, I think you may remember that Pastor David started a sermon series on the 7 deadly sins. And if you were here, you may also remember that I got to do 2 of the sins last summer. I got to do anger and envy. So, I thought since I'm preaching this month, that it would be beneficial to revisit the theme from last summer, only this time, instead of reflecting on the 7 deadly sins, I'm going to reflect on the 4 cardinal virtues. Now, for a refresher, the 7 deadly sins are lust, anger, envy, pride, sloth, greed, and gluttony. And the virtues are divided into 3 theological virtues taken from Scripture and 4 cardinal virtues that are taken from philosophy and the study of human nature. The theological virtues are very familiar. They're faith, hope, and love. And they are taken from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And the cardinal virtues, fortitude, prudence, temperance, and justice, come from classical philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. And they come filtered to Christianity through philosophers like Ambrose of Milan, Augustine of Hippo, and Thomas Aquinas. And I hope you're writing this down because there will be a test later. Just kidding. So, you don't hear much about the virtues, and admittedly, they're not as fun or as sexy as the 7 deadly sins. Movies have been made about the 7 deadly sins, like the movie Seven. But we really haven't heard of any movies about the virtues and what they do. So, I thought, as we're sitting socially distanced and quarantined during some time as we go through this challenge, a look at the virtues might not be a bad thing. And also, since the virtues are the antidotes to the sins, that we should take a look at the cures to our ills. So, before we begin, we should not forget that the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, that these are gifts from God. They're not anything that we really need to do, but they're given to us. Now, the cardinal virtues are actions. We have to take them. There is a relationship between the theological virtues, the gifts, and the cardinal virtues. So faith, hope, and love motivate the actions of fortitude, prudence, temperance, and justice. There's a relationship between these virtues. Faith, hope, and love motivate the actions of fortitude, prudence, temperance, and justice. And there's also a relationship between the cardinal virtues. For example, temperance and prudence prevent fortitude from becoming foolhardiness. So in other words, that restraint and wisdom prevent courage from becoming foolish. Running off blindly off a cliff is not an act of bravery. It's an act of foolishness. And I believe that we have forgotten some of these important lessons in our modern age. Since I only have 1 month to preach, I'm only covering the 4 cardinal virtues. And like I said, that's fortitude, prudence, temperance, and justice. And I'll be using them as a lens to examine the regular lectionary readings for this season. So, today our virtue is fortitude. So what is fortitude? Well, fortitude is an old-fashioned term, and it's sometimes translated as courage. It comes from the Greek andreia, or the Latin fortunato, and it's also termed as forbearance, strength, endurance, the ability to confront fear, uncertainty, and intimidation. Classical images of fortitude incorporate the image of a lion as a symbol of strength. And to help you remember this, or to think about how fortitude and the strength of a lion, think about the lion from The Wizard of Oz. The lion from The Wizard of Oz is not the picture of fortitude, strength, perseverance, at least at first. We find out at the end that he had these qualities. But a lion usually gives off these characteristics. Augustine of Hippo wrote, "Fortitude is love, readily bearing all things for the sake of that which is loved." I'll say that again. So fortitude, courage, is love, readily bearing all things for the sake of that which is loved. So let's see how fortitude relates to our scripture readings today. Now first, we had the Song of Solomon, and that was woven into our call to worship. And we don't often read the Song of Solomon in church. Maybe we hear it a few times at weddings, but it is so passionate. It speaks of a state of love that is pure and unbridled. It represents a passionate and reciprocal love that's sometimes used to characterize the relationship between people and God, and how we need one another so much, how we're passionate. A love that endures, a love that bears all things. And our first reading from Zechariah, shows how the reign of God, so strong in this love and strength of purpose, enters the gates of the city like a donkey. And not just a donkey, but a colt, which is the foal of a donkey. So it's humility based in humility. And so it's not a horse, it's not a war horse, it's not a regal horse, but this little baby donkey. And this reference is used by the gospel writers, and we're familiar with it from the readings on Palm Sunday. So much so that the writer of Matthew puts Jesus on a donkey and a colt. I kind of like to know how that works out, that he's on two at once. But Zechariah was trying to get across the idea of this small, humble colt. So the strength of purpose of God's kingdom is so powerful in this humility that it stops war chariots. That's pretty amazing. Now, in today's gospel, we see kind of a worn out Jesus. Jesus is just frustrated. And he's not worn out physically or spiritually, but he's impatient with everyone around him. And he says, "To what shall I compare this generation? What are you like? You're like children in the marketplace." Now, for us, that's kind of a charming picture of happy children in a marketplace running around. For ancient people, children in a marketplace are idle. They're not doing anything. They're not good for anything. Children should be helping their parents, or they should be working on the farm or doing something. But children in a marketplace running around unsupervised, they're not good for anything. So he's basically saying, you people are worthless. Here first, you tell me that we sang our dirges and you did not weep. We played our pipes and you did not dance. These aren't real funeral dirges. These aren't real joyous wedding songs for people to dance to. These are play acting. They're useless things done by useless people. And Jesus is frustrated. I also love it that he said, you know, John came not eating and you said he had a demon. I'm eating and you say that I'm a glutton. What is it? So he's upset with everyone's inauthenticity and their criticisms. You can almost hear him commenting on social media. You can hear him with his frustrations on these idle prattlings on Facebook or Twitter. Children in the marketplace, inauthentic. But God calls us to be authentic, to dwell in love, and not just in the love of God or oneself, but love of other human beings. And not just for the moment, not when we're happy, but an unwavering, steadfast love based in strength and courage. We are made and called to love one another, not to criticize one another, not to be impatient with one another, not to bend other people to our will. So don't be caught up in the moment, but look at the long game. Look at the end goal. Now, I have to interject right now because some of you may be thinking, well, fortitude just means sticking with it and being inflexible. But fortitude should not be confused with stubbornness, selfishness, or inflexibility. This is where the deadly sins come in, because the deadly sins can hijack the virtues and corrupt them into something hurtful and ugly. For example, fortitude mixed with pride turns into narcissism. Envy and fortitude turn into suspicion and hatred. This is what makes neighbors distrust neighbors and strangers. And it converts the rejoicing of the good fortune of others and offering opportunity to those seeking a new life, changes it into resentment, to denial, to refusal to help. Envy and fortitude can perpetuate injustice and oppression. Greed combined with fortitude results in sort of a robber baron mentality that seeks personal gain at any cost. So we must constantly examine what our motivations are, what the motivations of our leaders are, and if virtue is still virtuous, or if it's been corrupted by sin. So, we are in a very trying time. And we're dealing with COVID-19 and the effects of the coronavirus, and we get impatient. We're waiting for the next thing to happen. We're waiting for our lives to get back to normal. It is hard. We don't want to wear our masks. We want our communities to come back together. We want to see our loved ones and hug them. We want life. But unfortunately, that's not possible right now. And this is where the virtue of fortitude comes in. Because our impatience is not based in love. And so when we start protesting or screaming at one another that I'm not going to wear a mask, it is my right to go out and do what I want and not wear a mask, it isn't based in love. It's based in that narcissism of fortitude turned into stubbornness through the sin of pride. So, we must be on guard. And I know it seems unending. It seems inconvenient. And we're human beings. And we get impatient. We want things to get back to normal. But with the gifts of faith, hope, and love, and the virtue of fortitude, we can get through anything. This is how we know Christ. And knowing Christ's way is the way to know God and the way to experience God's love. And God knows that sometimes we're hypocritical and sometimes we're impatient because we get tired. I know I'm tired. And after a period of time and forbearance and persistence, we come to the place that Jesus is talking to at the end of Scripture. This is a place of strength where Jesus offers rest. Fortitude and endurance must also have a tie to rest and Sabbath. But this has to come at the appropriate time. If you think about the creation story, God works for 7 days and then he puts the gift of Sabbath at the end. Now just think of how absurd it would be for God to, at the beginning of Genesis, say, "Let there be light." And then he says, "Whew, that was so hard. All that light making, I'm going to go take a rest." What would have happened? The rest of creation would have faltered and fallen apart. The appropriate time, after all was done, after all was good. So this is what fortitude entails. Persisting to the end, having the strength of vision, unwavering purpose, and love to see something to the end. So, when Jesus said, "Take my yoke is easy," it's a paradox. Because yokes aren't easy. Burdens aren't light. But through God, through love, through fortitude, it's bearable. And love is a paradox. But that's what we're left with in the end. So, when we take time to run the race to the end, and have strength of purpose, courage to see things through, we're able to see each other with authenticity and with love. We are no longer children in the marketplace, criticizing, finding fault, inviting sin to corrupt the virtues, and pretending that things will go away on their own. It's only when we accept God's love and choose to live in love, that's the important part, we have to choose to live in love, that we are transformed. We are purposed we can put our hardships and our burdens onto God, lift our yokes together, and as the Song of Solomon states, leap like a stag. We no longer dwell in darkness and sin, but we're upheld by virtue, the virtue of fortitude, strength, courage. In this time of crisis, I recommend fortitude. It's a good thing. Peace.